In March 1953, Moscow was thrown into turmoil. Stalin was dead. He had ruled the Soviet Union for almost 30 years.
The country was in profound shock and did not know what would happen next. There was a fear inside the leadership that without Stalin, other great powers might crush us or might use some chink in the armor to, to penetrate. That was almost paranoid sense.
Lavrenti Beria, still in charge of the secret police and the Soviet nuclear program, now assumed a dominant role in the Kremlin. But within a few months, a coup led by Nikita Khrushchev put an end to Beria's influence. To warn its enemies, the new leadership made a dramatic announcement, claiming to possess an H-bomb before the weapon was even tested.
The United States is said to have a monopoly on the hydrogen bomb. Apparently, it would be of comfort to them if that were the truth, but it is not. The government considers it necessary to announce that the United States does not hold a monopoly in the production of the hydrogen bomb.
They used this bomb to boost their political position and to boost not only the morale of their people, but their own legitimacy.
The test of Andrei Sakharov's layer cake was scheduled to take place 4 days after the hasty proclamation. A last-minute evacuation of thousands of civilians, made necessary by the expected power of the blast, only added to the tension at the test site in Kazakhstan.
It shows, I think, how focused they were just on the mechanics of the bomb itself, on getting that right. And then only at the last minute does one of the scientists using, in fact, the American publication on nuclear weapons effects point out that, hey, look, this could be dangerous for the people living in the area.
Of course, we worried about the success of the test, wrote Sakharov. But for me, anxiety about potential casualties was paramount. Catching a glimpse of myself in a mirror, I was struck by the change. I looked old and gray. Sakharov's layer cake worked. Though not nearly as powerful as the American breakthrough tested 9 months earlier, it had one key advantage. It was a usable weapon, small enough to be dropped from an airplane. Almost immediately, Los Alamos assembled a team to analyze the fallout from the Soviet test. Hans Bethe drew a strikingly accurate picture of Sakharov's design. It was alternating layers of uranium and lithium deuteride compressed by high explosives. The Soviets, Bethe concluded, had yet to discover the true super, the bomb of virtually unlimited power. In August 1953, just 2 weeks after the test of the layer cake, newly elected President Dwight Eisenhower decided to stage his own nuclear show of force. In Korea, Stalin's death had broken the stalemate, and both sides finally seemed willing to end the conflict. To keep peace negotiations on track, Eisenhower called on LeMay's bombers.
Our mission called for me to take 20 B-36s with nuclear weapons on board and go to Okinawa and sit on the alert.
The mission, codenamed Big Stick, carried an implied threat by placing SAC's newest bomber close to the Soviet and Chinese border.
The B-36 really wasn't much fun to fly. It was a gigantic thing. They used to say it was like sitting on your front porch and flying your house around. It was big on the outside and small on the inside. Very cramped for the crews, and the missions were long. It wasn't a pleasurable assignment in a lot of ways, and yet I was very proud of it because the B-36s could hit targets within Russia that could be touched in no other way.
The idea is that one should use the nuclear superiority that we had and make overt and direct threats. Be prepared to use atomic bombs and to break down this psychological taboo that distinguishes nuclear weapons from other weapons, that we ought to just treat them as being like any other weapon.
LeMay made sure that the mission did not go unnoticed. When the giant bombers landed at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, the press was on hand to report the event.
We stayed at Kadena and sit on the alert and cruise at the airplanes while the hostility cessation papers were being signed. And the B-36s being there with atomic weapons and ready to go was a warning to the North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese not to try anything funny when we were sitting around a peace table.
And the fact that the ceasefire occurs and the fact that it is not violated, I think caused Eisenhower to believe that this strategy worked, that it had paid off. And so they make it a general strategy of, in effect, cutting back on the amount of spending for non-nuclear weapons and relying more heavily on the nuclear deterrence to protect American global interests.
Rows of mannequins are set up out in the open, facing the blast. Each item of clothing and each color was carefully selected to give much-needed survival information.
With the new emphasis on nuclear arms, smaller atomic tests in the Nevada desert now became public spectacles as the administration set out to teach the American family survival skills for the nuclear age.
Operation Q, the atomic test program of the Federal Civil Defense Administration, as seen by June Cowan, reporter.
I arrived at Civil Defense Headquarters the day before the explosion was scheduled to take place and checked in at once with the official who was to brief me about the test. I need hardly tell you that I was anxious to learn all I could about the various types of houses to be tested.
Mannequin families supplied by private industry will represent Mr. and Mrs. America.
They called them mannequin families, and they dressed them up in JCPenney clothing, and they positioned them in various rooms of the house. And in one room, there was a child taking a nap. In another room, there was a family dinner party. And one of the things that they did was they placed families hiding underneath shelters.
I was especially interested in the food test program. As a mother and housewife, this appealed to me.
They equipped each of these homes with refrigerators, typical appliances one would find in a home, the kinds of foods one would eat, from baby food to adult food, and they exposed them to blast.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These were sort of like morality tales. Each film, each brochure was a morality tale. If you didn't prepare, you have only yourself to blame for being wounded or killed.
Remember this dining room group? Effects of an atomic blast in the house farthest from ground zero. Injury, perhaps death, in a tangle of debris, the result of being unprepared. House number 1, nearest ground zero, almost complete destruction, a mass of rubble and debris. Yet, in this lean-to shelter, you discover indications that a human being might have survived the blast with simple protection.
It asked American families to think about themselves not just as friends, neighborhoods, family members, but as warriors of a Cold War. And this really introduced a military purpose and practice into American family life.
The threat of nuclear war caused some leading scientists to renew their opposition to the H-bomb. In a secret report, Robert Oppenheimer raised serious questions about the wisdom and morality of U.S. nuclear planning. We are ignorant of the consequences of inflicting massive destruction and heavy civilian casualties in a brief period, he warned. Oppenheimer, who had never worked on the Super, condemned the idea of aiming hydrogen bombs at enemy cities. In Washington, Oppenheimer's persistent criticism hit a nerve. In the summer of 1953, the newly appointed chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Louis Strauss, decided to act.
As soon as Strauss became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, he moved to lift Oppenheimer's security clearance, to find reason to accuse him of espionage, or at least of bad advice, which is in fact what he was accused of.
I guess there were politics people in Washington who felt he was getting too big for his britches in the policy advising sense. And they went after him.
In April of 1954, the AEC held secret hearings to review the security clearance of its most prominent scientist. Oppenheimer stood accused of earlier left-wing sympathies and, more to the point, of opposing the development of the hydrogen bomb.
One by one, all the players in this complex, tragic story come back on stage and make their speech and play their part. Beta testified and Robbie testified, and significantly and really tragically, Teller testified.
I spent an hour with Edward Teller before his testimony, tried to talk him out of it, but it was to no avail.
I was called to testify about Oppenheimer. I was under oath. I took my testimony very seriously.
At the hearing, Teller said, "In a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better, and therefore trust more." The AEC did not renew Oppenheimer's security clearance, in effect ending his role as an advisor to the government. Transcripts of the hearings were leaked to the press, and Oppenheimer's humiliation became front-page news.
He retreated to the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was the director, and became what Yeats once called a smiling public man. But he was destroyed. His friends all say that.
Oppenheimer wasn't the only one harmed.
I lost the cooperation with most of my colleagues in America. And for me, the profession was more than a profession. It was also my circle of friends.
I thought that Teller would lose a lot of his friends. I didn't expect that it would go this far. And I am sorry for Edward Teller, and he made, in this case, a bad decision.
At the very moment Robert Oppenheimer stood accused, American scientists headed back to the Pacific. They would now test prototypes of an H-bomb, small enough to be dropped from a plane. The first test, codenamed Bravo, took place on Bikini Atoll in March 1954.
I think we were about 30 miles away, and it just kept rising and rising. It looked to me like what you might imagine a diseased brain, or the brain of some madman would look like, all the convolutions and so on. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger.
Something I'll never forget was the heat. I had the feeling a cloud was on top of me, but the heat just kept coming. Just kept coming on and on and on. And it was really scary because the heat doesn't go off.
The explosion was twice as large as expected, 40 times more powerful than Sakharov's layer cake. "200 miles from ground zero, a camera recorded the enormous blast. In minutes, the mushroom cloud reached an altitude of more than 15 miles.
It was unprecedented to have an explosion go that high, way up into the stratosphere around 100,000 feet, where we knew very little about the weather. We ran these balloons up to see which way the wind was blowing, but the knowledge was very sparse in those days.
A few hours after the Bravo test, radioactive fallout hit several inhabited islands in the area. But 2 days passed before the task force took action to rescue the affected population. In a film kept secret for decades, the AEC summarized the effects of the fallout.
229 Marshall Islanders and 28 American service personnel were evacuated to Kwajalein for survey and treatment. A majority of those receiving the heaviest radiation reported some transient nausea on the first or second day. Some loss of hair was a frequent symptom. Most of the Marshallese in this category developed multiple skin lesions, usually not severe, predominantly on the scalp, back of the neck, and feet.
The story of Bravo and its aftermath began to leak out a few weeks later when the Lucky Dragon, a Japanese fishing vessel, returned home from the Pacific. The boat's crew of 23 was suffering from severe radiation sickness. One fisherman later died. At At first, the administration maintained its silence.
No other program outside of intelligence ever had the kind of secrecy surrounding it that the nuclear program had, and everybody became used to that. You know, we don't have to explain what's going on. It's terribly secret, and if we do explain, somehow the Russians will be able to exploit this, and so we're not going to tell you. And Bravo broke into that.
Another byproduct of the stupendous mid-Pacific blast unfolds in San Francisco, where tuna fish, supposedly made radioactive during the tests, are scrutinized by federal agents armed with Geiger counters for signs of contamination. The fish shipped from Japan must undergo rigid inspection by food and drug officials before being allowed entry. In this case, the fish are given a clean bill of health.
In Washington, AEC Chairman Strauss was forced to respond.
The first shot has been variously described as devastating, out of control, and with other exaggerated and mistaken characterizations. I would not wish to minimize it. It was a very large blast in the megaton range, but at no time was the testing out of control.
I thought some of the stuff coming out of Washington was pretty silly. They began to talk about radiation exposure in terms of sunshine units, which I thought was one of the dumbest phrases that come down the pike in a long time. You know, designed to somehow put a happy face on it, on the impossible.
In the Soviet Union, the official news agency downplayed the Bravo test. But Russian scientists were stunned by its force. Igor Kurchatov, scientific director of the Soviet nuclear weapons program, warned of the new danger.
Kurchatov and 3 of the other leading scientists in the project write a short report for the leadership in which they say essentially that a nuclear war, especially a war using thermonuclear weapons, could lead to the end of all life on Earth. It's a very stark document.
The explosion of about 100 large hydrogen bombs, Kurchatov wrote, will be sufficient to create on the whole globe conditions under which life will be impossible.
What's really interesting about it is that it cuts absolutely against the official Soviet line.
The Kremlin leadership shelved Kurchatov's report, and the Soviet military soon staged a dramatic exercise that challenged the scientists' conclusion.
In 1954, we conducted a training exercise near the village of Totskoy in the Urals, using an actual atomic bomb. Thirty to 40 minutes later, troops, both on foot and in tanks, all of them wearing gas masks, entered the contaminated zone. All the necessary measuring equipment was installed. In the discussion that followed, Marshal Bulganin, who was in charge of the exercise, said that the results showed none of the troops who passed through the contaminated zone had been exposed to high enough levels of radiation to warrant fear of this weapon. And so an atomic war was not as frightening as the imperialists would have us believe.
At the Nevada test site, the American military also used smaller atomic blasts to learn how to survive a nuclear war.
Some aircraft are instrumented to record the strains and pressures inflicted upon them. We're trying every angle and every gadget we can to find out what really does happen when an atomic bomb kicks out fiercely at the world around it. Shot day. Camp Desert Rock. H minus 5 hours. Like all too many people, both in and out of the military, before these men got their assignment for this operation, they had many misconceptions about the bomb and its effects. Some of them thought they would never again be able to have families. Some of them expected to glow for hours after the bomb went off. Many of them were afraid. They had never taken the time or invested the effort to learn the facts about what to do in case of atomic warfare.
Remain in your holes until the command raise has been given at H plus 3 seconds. If you stand up too soon, the heat will give you the equivalent of a severe sunburn.
Everyone kneel down in your foxholes, look down, and stay down.
Like their Soviet counterparts, the American military came to an upbeat conclusion.
In the minds of many of the men, there was doubt and fear before. Now there is confidence. Confidence that comes only with experience. Just treat it with respect rather than fear. Use a little common sense and observe a few basic precautions. After the walkthrough, we moved back out of the contaminated zone to our parking area. We made it, and so can anyone else who goes through this kind of operation.
In the Soviet Union, the success of the layer cake brought rich rewards to Andrei Sakharov and several other leading scientists. Sakharov received the title Hero of Socialist Labor, as well as the Stalin Prize. At the age of 33, he became the head of the theoretical department at the Artemis Weapons Lab. But there was little time to celebrate.
An absolutely insane task was set for us, not to lag behind the United States by one iota. We had to have everything the Americans had. There couldn't be the slightest gap. And so as soon as new information arrived about the work in this or that direction, we absolutely had to do the same thing.
The scientists at Artemis recognized at once that the enormous force of the Bravo explosion signaled a breakthrough. Sakharov's team had been looking for ways to improve on the layer cake. Now he enlisted additional help in a frantic effort to catch up. Only a few weeks after the Bravo test, the Soviet scientists hit upon the same idea of radiation implosion, the concept first developed by Teller and Ulan. The Soviet Union now knew how to build the Superbomb.
We like to believe, and many leading people believe, that if we won't give away our secrets, they will remain secrets forever. I think we were ahead of the world, not by much.
They weren't secrets, they were physics. The rest is just the essentially trivial problem of figuring out how to make the physics into machines.
In November 1955, a year and a half after Bravo, the Soviet version of the H-bomb was ready.
Taking part in the test of the two-stage bomb made a greater impression on me than anything else in my entire life. The plane was flying at the altitude of 12 to 15 kilometers. You could see the white jet trail in the sky. It seemed that it was right above our heads because the angle was quite steep, and that made the situation tense. At the moment of the explosion, we were standing, and we covered our faces with our hands as instructed. Immediately, it felt as if you had put your head into an open oven. The heat was unbearable. Then we had this impressive view of the fireball, the mushroom cloud, all of it on a huge scale. What was shocking was that this great scene was unfolding in absolute silence. And when the shockwave approached us, we dropped to the ground. Thunder. Stones were flying. Someone was hit by a large rock. There were several claps of thunder, and the ground was shaking.
Unusual atmospheric conditions created a powerful shock wave that hit towns more than 50 miles from ground zero.
I remember when we arrived back at our hotel. The windows and doors had been blown out. It felt as if the place had been hit by an air raid. But our joy was indescribable. We started celebrating immediately. We took out all of our supplies. Someone brought alcohol. There was a sense of fulfillment, of having completed our task. That this beautiful, complex device, and that's what it was from a physicist's point of view, had worked, was a triumph of science, of course. We all understood that.
The celebrations were soon overshadowed. 2 people, a soldier and a 2-year-old girl, had been killed by falling debris. Sakharov approached ground zero soon after the blast. When you see all of this yourself, something in you changes, he wrote. When you see the burned birds who are withering on the scorched steppe, when you see how the shock wave blows away buildings like houses of cards, when you feel the reek of splintered bricks, when you sense melted glass, you immediately think of times of war. All of this triggers an irrational yet very strong emotional impact. How not to start thinking of one's responsibility at this point? The test left a lasting impression on Sakharov and Kurchatov. Both men became deeply troubled by the consequences of their work. Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader in the Kremlin, saw the danger too. When I was appointed first secretary of the Central Committee and learned all the facts of nuclear power, I couldn't sleep for several days, he wrote. Then I became convinced that we could never possibly use these weapons. And when I realized that, I was able to sleep again. By 1955, the H-bomb had become a symbol of doom. Hailed just a few years earlier as the weapon to save the world from communism, the Super was turning into the ultimate nightmare.
It's very important to remember that both the Soviet Union and the United States were countries that had been traumatized by surprise attack. The Americans with Pearl Harbor and the Russians with the German attack of June 1941. That experience never leaves them throughout the Cold War. That preoccupation with the possibility of surprise attack is always there.
To guard against surprise attack, LeMay kept his planes, some now armed with H-bombs, on constant alert. Each crew was trained to attack a specific Soviet target.
The biggest thing in your life was your wartime mission. You lived for it. You knew that they might blow the whistle at any time, and when they did, that's where you were going. Unit commanders were never permitted to be more than 3 rings away on the telephone. If you wanted to go out for dinner, you had a radio in your car that you'd be on, say, I'm going to be mobile, and when I come off of mobile, I'll be at such and such a number, the number of the restaurant. When you'd go in, you'd let them know who you were and that the possibility that you might get a phone call while you were there. It was a way of life.
LeMay's plan was clear. My determination was to put everyone in SAC into this frame of mind. We are at war now. So if we actually did go to war the very next morning, or even that night, no preliminary motions would be wasted.
It was a totally different concept of how to fight a war. And it required the United States to do something we had never done before, which is to have a huge military establishment in peacetime, to have the whole stockpile in hand, all these things that essentially militarized a very peaceful democracy.
Beginning in 1954, regular alert exercises were held in cities across the U.S. But now that both sides had the H-bomb, there was no place to hide.
The idea was, during the early years of the Eisenhower administration, that shelter was not going to work given the advances in technology and given the advent of the hydrogen bomb, that it was silly and sheer folly to expect that shelters could protect people from such powerful weapons.
Keep your radio tuned to this frequency. There is a traffic plan for the evacuation of the city. Do not...
So instead of duck and cover, the slogan was run like the wind.
All cars in the downtown area must follow the green lights. They will lead you out of the danger area by the quickest route.
Basically, Operation Alert was a war game. It was a hypothetical attack on a city, or as they referred to them, on a target area. They would decide how many bombs, what the size of those bombs were, what the size of the population would be that was killed, the size of the population that would go homeless.
There was concern running all through the Eisenhower administration about the panic effects, the breakdown of law and order that would occur, who would exercise any kind of control or support for the people. Those were some of the things that we would test out during these exercises.
When I finally got dealing with people at the White House level, what I discovered is it wasn't civil defense per se. What they wanted civil defense in order to make sure that the American people would not be too frightened. Not to save lives, but to make people believe that they can survive a nuclear war.
One of the reasons that people are beginning to protest against the whole civil defense apparatus is the recognition, especially after the hydrogen bomb, that this is pointless, that there is no way to imagine surviving individually or as a nation in the event of a nuclear holocaust with weapons of this magnitude.
In New York City, the protests began with isolated acts of civil disobedience.
The sirens were going. I looked around and there's not a soul around. And civil defense guys come. And they said, you're going to have to take shelter. I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. This is my park. I'm sitting here with my children. No.
The protests made headlines in the New York press. The following year, thousands of women brought their children to the same park to demonstrate against the alert exercise.
It wasn't the first time that women have used the banner of motherhood to protest political realities, but it had a very important resonance at a time when motherhood was so glorified. So when you start to have mothers protesting, it was very powerful.
But Operation Alert continued.
No matter how many times they studied panic, no matter how many times they tested a communication system, no matter how many times they set up a mass feeding exercise, there was no defense against the hydrogen bomb. Nevertheless, they continued to practice it in this kind of ritualized way, and even President Eisenhower would participate.
President Eisenhower leads the way in a test evacuation of the entire executive branch. The chief executive heads for a secret retreat, the first time the government has abandoned the capital since it was burned in the War of 1812.
We are here to determine whether or not the government is prepared in time of emergency to continue the functions of government, so there shall be no interruption in the business that must be carried on.
In private, Eisenhower admitted the exercise was futile.
Once the hydrogen weapon was available, you began to hear from him that any idea of nuclear war would be, as he said, an absurdity or a form of insanity. No longer was war an extension of policy by other means, but it was a form of mutual suicide.
The United States is piling up armaments which it well knows will never provide for its ultimate safety, the president told his advisors. We are piling up these armaments because we do not know what else to do to provide for our security.
On the American side, with the buildup of nuclear forces, you see an increasing belief in the possibility of a knockout blow against the Soviet Union. And on the Soviet side, you see the increasing fear that the Americans might try a knockout blow. And so the Soviet interest then becomes to try to preempt an American attack.
Of course, technically, the one who strikes first, especially if it is a preemptive strike, gains the advantage over the other side. But the thing is, even if you strike first, you will perish together with the defeated side. That is the paradox of our time.
Both countries continued to prepare for the worst. By 1960, the SAC war plan called for the launch of more than 3,000 nuclear weapons, including hundreds of hydrogen bombs, from bases around the world to attack in the first few hours of conflict 1,000 separate targets in the communist bloc.
This could not be more at odds with Eisenhower's own thinking about the consequences of nuclear weapons. And how Eisenhower could sit there and think in those very progressive terms, while at the same time allowing SAC and General LeMay to be piling up thousands of weapons and devising war plans that would involve the use of these weapons simultaneously, is very difficult to fathom.
We felt that the only way we could assure that it didn't happen was to have the capability here in SAC to deter the Russians from doing that, and having the honor and the American ethics of not doing it yourself.
But what does it mean that a country that believes in human dignity, even the dignity of the enemy to the degree that that's possible in war, was preparing to slaughter an entire population of another country? Never mind the fact that the fallout from this killing of a nation would come back to us and kill most of us as well.
30 seconds to go. ADI right.
It was the use of these weapons and the becoming proficient with them and the planning to use them at their maximum capability that really we felt was the one way to avoid all-out nuclear war. I know that's anomalous, but we couldn't think of any other way to keep it from happening.
Now that the race to build the Superbomb had ended without a clear winner, the focus shifted to a new race, to develop faster, more accurate means of delivering nuclear weapons to their targets. In Washington, Edward Teller found strong support for his argument that nuclear superiority held the key to the nation's survival. He later became a leading advocate of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which promised to protect the United States from the very weapon he had helped invent. Andrei Sakharov, like Teller, continued to work on nuclear arms, but increasingly he found himself in conflict with the Soviet regime. He became the most prominent and outspoken advocate of human rights and democracy in his homeland. Curtis LeMay retired from the Air Force in 1965. He never questioned his belief in large-scale strategic bombing. In his memoirs, he reflected on the unimaginable power of the hydrogen bomb. That beautiful devilish pod underneath, he wrote, clinging as a fierce child against its mother's belly, carries all the conventional bomb explosive force of World War II and everything which came before. One B-58 can load that concentrated firepower and convey it to any place on the globe. And let it sink down, and let it go off, and bruise the stars and planets and satellites listening in. Long after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the United States and Russia continued to maintain several thousand nuclear warheads on constant alert. Getting rid of the super, it seemed, was even harder than building it.
They came to build an American pyramid, a colossus of concrete across the raging Colorado. It would forever change the West. Hoover Dam. Next time on The American Experience.
Won't you listen, my dear brother, for it's time for us to gather. God is getting mighty angry for the sinful things we've done. He gave us all this blessed land, and this I cannot understand. A weapon of destruction to destroy us everyone. When that hail bomb falls, when that hail bomb falls.
To order Race for the Superbomb on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Screaming, dying, praying when that hail bomb falls.
A production of WGBH, Boston. Major funding for The American Experience is provided by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you, and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century.